Aaron, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Thanks, Karen.
Yeah. Just. 9:30 game time starts. Last one. So now we're moving to something that's like actually. Essentially. Oh, yeah. So that's my main guy that I have to be. That's pretty well.
Yeah, at 6 o'clock, can you all stand for the pledge of allegiance? I'd like to call the meeting order. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, thanks everyone. Welcome to the August 15th Credit River Planning Commission meeting. Our first order of business tonight is to approve tonight's agenda. Our agenda tonight consists of two items, actually two items on each thing, 2 items on the consent agenda and then 2 public hearings we're going to have. One of them related to the city's shoreland ordinance and the second one related to the ordinance for regulating, and I'm going to say this one time tonight, then I'm going to abbreviate it, tetrahydrocannabinol products or THC. Would anyone, any commission member like to add anything to our tonight's agenda? No. Okay. Hearing none, can I get a motion to approve it?
So moved.
A motion by Commissioner Olson. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Seconded by Commissioner Tandy. All in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Motion carried. Okay. Before I get into the consent agenda, I just want to mention one item. Last Monday night at the city council meeting, the city council talked about having a workshop to talk about trails in the city of Credit River. And we're also going to talk in this workshop about ideas, the Credit River Rural Alliance and their, what is it again? They want.
They have asked to do a presentation on the results of their survey.
Right.
And so we're looking at doing a work session where we'd have a joint work session of the city council and the planning commission. Have the discussion on the trails, but also have that as the presentation from them on their survey results. So that can all kind of occur in one work session.
Great. And that'd be a combination of both the city council and the planning commission.
Correct.
Okay, great. So be on the lookout for an email from Kathy. She's going to ask for some dates that were available, but it will not be a normal city council meeting date or a planning commission meeting date. It'll be something outside of those dates. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so let's move on to the consent agenda. Those items on the planning commission agenda, which are considered routine and non-controversial, are included as part of the consent agenda. Unless a planning commission member specifically requests that an item on the consent agenda be removed and considered separately, items on the consent agenda are considered under one motion, second, and vote. Any item removed from the consent agenda shall be placed at the end of general business. Tonight, we have 2 items on the consent agenda. We have both the May 18th, 2023 Planning Commission meeting minutes and the June 15th, 2023 Planning Commission meeting minutes. Can I get a motion to approve tonight's consent agenda?
I'll make a motion.
Motion by Commissioner Casey. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Commissioner Wolf. All in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. Anyone opposed? Motion to approve tonight's consent agenda is carried. Thank you. All right, let's move on to the public hearings. We have 2 tonight. The first one is related to the shoreland ordinance. We have 2 items in front of the commission members. Should have received a draft of the ordinance number 2023-07, amending the zoning ordinance related to the shoreland overlay, and then also a copy of the shoreland overlay map for the city of Credit River. So before I open up the public hearing, I'd like to ask City Planner Nash, maybe summarize the reason why we're holding another public hearing for this ordinance, since we did do one late last year. And then let us know whether any substantive changes were made to the ordinance that we did look at last year. So if you could do that, Cindy, that'd be great.
Thank you. So there are no
Here we go.
There are not any substantive changes to the ordinance you reviewed last year. The Planning Commission did recommend approval of this ordinance to the City Council. The reason for holding another public hearing is that in the process of drafting this ordinance, I had multiple different word versions of the ordinance that would go back and forth between me and the DNR staff. And that person apparently doesn't use Word. So it caused an immense number of formatting issues that I wanted to resolve before we put it on the City Council agenda and put it into the actual ordinance format. You'll notice they're still not all resolved even, but it's good enough now that I can get the rest of them in formatting and codifying it back into our actual zoning ordinance.
Great.
So the reason for it is just that length of time in between when you actually had recommended it last.
Mhm.
I didn't want to go to council at this point with that many months elapsed.
Great. Okay, thank you. I'm now going to open up the public hearing related to the proposed ordinance 2023-07. Cindy, did we get any written comments from any residents?
We did that.
Okay, thank you. Are there any residents here tonight that would like to speak on behalf of themselves related to this ordinance, proposed ordinance? If you do would like to speak, if you could.
So maybe we come later.
Would anyone interested in speaking related to the ordinance tonight?
Thank you very much.
If you hit the number, hit the button said to before you speak, that'd be great.
Ed Walker, I'm a developer, actually, I live in the next township. I think it is mostly the same. I looked through it again. It made me nervous that it's on the docket again. I thought we had it resolved. Caused me sleepless nights. Again, to the planning commission, my questions are, I don't remember this one before, but I could be wrong. I couldn't find the old one anymore. I looked, but it ain't on the website.
No.
Because it isn't codified, it ain't an ordinance yet, so it isn't there. Okay, so number one, I'll try to go through it quickly, is on page 4 under impervious surfaces. We're including decks now. I don't know of any place else that calls a deck an impervious surface, because typically the water goes between the boards and drops to the ground as if it wasn't there.
That's a DNR definition, and that was in there last time.
Okay, and the other thing is swimming pools. Swimming pools, they don't run off.
Same thing though, that's from that definition's from the DNR, and so that's the one they approved.
Yeah, okay, so. I take issue with just following the DNR blindly, especially in Credit River, because Credit River now as a city is very unique in that it has gonna have urban development, but it has a lot of rural development. These rules being applied in rural settings, I don't know that they could translate well. I mean, we just follow what the DNR says without any pushback or any like justification. No place else is a deck impervious. That's all they define it, that's fine, but they're not impervious. Water goes right around and through them. And for people who are going to build in the northern part in the urban areas, that deck may be a difference between getting the house to fit with, you know, an impervious surface ratio and not. And to say, no, you can't build it that way because you have a deck. Well, the water goes through a deck. Now, if the water doesn't go through the deck, if they put a drain system in and now it's being channeled one way, well, then it would be impervious. But pools collect the water and then water evaporates. So they don't run off out of a pool at all. So I understand they're saying it, but you know, I guess my issue becomes when we just start following what other government entities say, and none of this is driven by Credit River as you're becoming a city and want to set up your own rules. Has anybody ever read through all these Minnesota statutes and rules and everything that we're just blindly signing on to? And do we have to really sign on to all of that? Am I trying to make this a big problem? No, but because it came up again, you know, I had to dig into it. Okay, maybe Cindy, you can help me with this one on page 13, tributary river. All public and rivers shown on the public water inventory map for Scott County, a copy which hereby adopted by residents shall be considered a tributary. Was that in the old one too?
It was in the old one as well, and this map was in there, so these are the map
Yep.
that's on the screen, it's the same ones.
Okay, so then. Again, it talks about impervious surface and sewer treatment can't be in the setbacks. And that would be a deck. So the house got to be so many feet from the ordinary high water level, and decks used to be able to extend back into that. Well, now by calling a deck an impervious surface, it's going to have to move the whole structure further from the ordinary high water. Again, I don't think it's a problem for us in the rural areas, but in the urban areas, that could become an issue. And then one more question. Let's see if I can find it. Here on page 8, 70.2, 70-2, the county rule was 25 acres. If it says pursuant to rule 6120, no lake, pond, or flow is less than 10 acres in size needs to be regulated in a shoreline regulation. The county one that this came from was 25 acres. Did that change just because we're going to a city?
That changed because they have different requirements for cities than for.
Yep, and that goes to my point where, okay, if we just blanketly treat Credit River City all the same, we mistreat the rural areas. Maybe the 10 acres makes sense in the urban areas, but in the rural areas, when it was Scott County, 25 acres was fine. And simply because you became incorporated, why did that change? Well, the DNR says it has to. Well, maybe it doesn't. We argued about the 35-foot rule.
So statutes and rules say that it has to, it did not make a significant change. There was a couple little flowage areas that were added and that was it.
Yeah, it just seems, it went from 25 acres to 10 acres, so. The size of the flowage had to drop by over 50% now to be not required to be looked at as a shoreline. In my opinion, those are big changes, and I still think that the dividing line of 185th, north of 185th, that probably makes good sense. South of 185th, it doesn't, it mistreats. Because we can have an area like the creek that we work with in Yellowstone that runs quite a long ways. But it really doesn't affect that many properties because the properties are so much bigger than they are in the urban areas. So when we're trying to make an ordinance that's one size fits all, it mistreats down there, or maybe it mistreats up there when you have a city that is so different from north to south. Okay, so the next thing was under the open space design, and I asked this, Cindy, because we've kind of been working on that with Tim.
Yep, what page are you on?
I'm gonna be on page 30. It says open space maintenance administration under A. And that says, like permanent easement, public dedication, or other equally effective permanent means to create open space preservation. I'm good with that. But the next one says development, organization, and functioning. It says we have to have a homeowners association. And I don't want to have a homeowners association. We really don't want any common ground that's usable. We can create open space and keep it open, but there's not going to be anything to maintain on it. This kind of makes it sound like we have to have, unless an equally effective alternative community framework is established, all residential plan unit developments must use an owners association with the following features. I don't want to have that. So I don't like that it's in here because this is saying like it has to. So, and maybe I didn't catch it the first time around because I didn't think we were going to have open space. Well, now it does affect us if we're going to have to work with the open space design for the Yellowstone.
Yeah, and this was in there the first time around. I know it was in there. I just can't speak right now to,
Can you define equally effective alternative any way you want? So that doesn't apply then?
potentially, I mean, clearly there's some opening there with that language, but.
Well, and I think the point would be if there's really nothing to maintain, what would be the purpose of a homeowners association? If the open space is natural areas over a big wetland or a big open space, there's nothing maintained. We don't want to create community amenities that have to be maintained, like trails and bike paths or playgrounds or tennis courts or anything like that. If those things were created, yeah, someone's got to maintain them. So
Give me a quick second here. So this is embedded within their PUD section.
Mhm,
So it would be if there's a PUD to start with.
mhm.
Yeah, I mean, this was in there the whole time, but that is their rules for PUDs. They don't let you, the purpose to them of PUDs typically is surrounding, trying to get smaller lot sizes. Definitely should not likely impact the north part of what you're trying to do.
No,
And we certainly might have to look at that when we're doing your development plans, but
and I don't like this, that sounds self-serving, but this is, you related to what you're working on. And even on the south side, we're not really increasing densities. The way Tim's explained it to me, we average 3 acres across the whole thing on average. If you want to try to slice it, dice it into just a small area, you have more density, but your ordinance, if I understood Jim right, encourages cluster developments with smaller lots when they're hooked to a community system.
when they have a cluster developments is when you take your net density of what you can have and you cluster all the lots in one location, and then you preserve the rest as open space.
Well, I'm trying to figure out how we fit in
Yeah.
here, and I see this and it says, gotta have a PUD. I don't wanna have a PUD, but people don't want PUDs, they come in, first 3 questions, there's a homeowners association here. Oh, good, all right, I'll tell you what the lots cost. So those are my comments.
So I'm a little confused. So Cindy, what Ted is saying is that any new development in the city of Credit River, if we approve this tonight. Every new development's gonna have to have a homeowners association.
No,
Okay,
Just PUDs, if you use the PUD or the open space plan, then it is requiring it, and here's my trouble with that, is an outside agency is telling you what to do. I know, Cindy, we disagree on this respectfully, it's a model ordinance to follow, but I don't think you have to follow it in lockstep. I think if you have good justification why we don't need some of this, I think you can make a case like, yeah, we don't want to have that, because it doesn't pertain to us, particularly in the south part of our city. We're different here. I mean, how do you say it's the same as the north part? How do you say?
but we're not, Ted, we're not unique in the state.
I don't know of another city that has this much rural development that's gonna be permanent rural and that density on the north side of 185th. I believe, Bill, that you are unique in that regard.
you're not though. You have Corcoran, Medina, Orono, all of these western Hennepin County cities that are very similar to Credit River.
And how do they handle?
The same way, basically, they have a part of their city that ends up being urban and a part that ends up being rural, and there's a couple different zoning districts, obviously. You know, we have rural residential and they're going to have a whole different series of multiple different high density or higher density districts. And they blend the two.
Yeah, but this is, in my opinion, limiting the rural areas to rules that are built for urban growth, not growing urban out here. But we're applying urban rules because we're being labeled a city. I don't know if that's a good reason. This was the same argument I had last time.
But these were the same rules that Scott County had before.
Close, but not exactly the same. There's differences in that 25 acre thing down.
Absolutely, that's different.
Yes, and I understand why you're saying. My common sense approach to it is, that shouldn't apply to the rural areas. The rural areas didn't change what you called it a city. I can see if you're gonna call it a city and then develop this in urban, well then apply the urban rules. But if you're gonna stay rural, apply the rural rules. That's my point. What makes me nervous is when we take something and we're changing it because the government said we have to. But we're just taking what they're telling us. Nobody's digging through and going through, okay, how does this impact us really? How does this make Credit River better or worse? Is this a good thing for us to do or is this a bad thing? I don't know if we're doing that. All these Minnesota rules and state statutes, and, you know.
Well, Ted, we can't close our eyes to those. I mean, we can't just like make up. No, let me ask you this, Cindy, does Bob review these things to make sure that they're?
Bob, yes, Bob reviews them. And the way that the Minnesota Shoreland rules work, they have a model template of what you're supposed to
Yes.
follow.
Yes.
And they go through their checklist. Do you have this? Do you have that? Do you have this? And if you don't have it, they tell you to change it.
Right.
And then you can negotiate with them for some implementation flexibility.
Yeah.
In some places, but it takes a pretty strong case to make that change. Which they did grant us on the height requirement. They allowed us to increase that to 35 feet from their 25 feet. But typically, when you do that, they're actually looking for something in return. So if they give us something, they're gonna want us to be stronger in regulatory measures in some other part of it. So it isn't just a take it or leave it kind of thing.
In the process of, if we want to ask for some of the things Ted's talking about, we have to get denied by the DNR. Most likely, and then we have to take them to court, or what is the process for getting the change we want or getting the ordinance we want? And how long of a process is that?
Kathy might have some input here.
I would say, you know, the DNR has been granted the authority in this area, so we have the ability to implement an ordinance and to take over the jurisdiction. The DNR can basically take that away from us. And not allow that piece of it. But if you wanted to go around it, you're basically looking at going to the legislature and going to the state. I don't think it's really court, but it's going to the state and asking them to change the laws. And get some framework change, probably start at that level before you really move on down. So I mean, you can try to negotiate with the DNR to make changes to little pieces and parts of things, but if you wanted to change it on a larger scale, you're probably going to the state and trying to get them to pass legislation that was going to change the framework that the DNR is then operating under.
Okay, thank you. Anything else, Ted? Yep, thank you. Yep, thank you. Is there anyone else that would like to speak tonight related to this ordinance? Good evening, Mark. Turn on your mic too, thank you. Nice catch.
Hands like feet. Mark Seamer, 17,351 Deerfield Drive, Southeast Prior Lake. My only comment is, as being a retired state employee, I understand the DNR's thought pattern in some of this. However, could we use, or could we perhaps change the language to say that a PUD may or may not have to have an HOA? And just get around it that way. And then the council, the commission, and then the council makes the determination. If I understand what the wording, it said, the PUD said it had to have an HOA.
It said unless there's a suitable other. I'm
Equally
paraphrasing right
effective
now, equally
alternative
effective, yes.
framework.
Um,
You can make case for it's like,
right, if you were having something owned by a land trust or something, or a local government unit, that would be an equally effective option, for example.
So,
And that language tags along,
thanks.
by the way, with the existing language that's in the open space design district within the zoning ordinance, that would require that permanent protection of the open space as well.
So if we change this, you're saying we'd have to change something else too? Opens.
I'm saying it could be in conflict with that.
Oh, okay. Right. Is there anyone else that would like to speak on tonight related to this ordinance? Okay, hearing none, can I get a motion to close the public hearing?
I'll make that motion.
A motion by Commissioner Wolf, is there a second?
I'll second.
Second by Commissioner Olson, all in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Hearing none, motion carried. Any other comments, questions? Yeah. Go ahead.
Just one, I want to acknowledge the comments and understand. That there are thoughts about how aspects apply, and I appreciate staff's explanations for what some of the implications could be. As I continue reading through this, there's been a lot of really good work done. This is just an observation, take it or leave it. I know that there are a lot of definitions and acronyms that get used and sometimes interchangeably. As I was looking through, just simply, trying to track one paragraph, one section to the next. Sometimes I was getting tripped up when I was seeing the acronyms without the definition. And just thinking about our residents and understanding the ordinances, wondering if, at some point, if we have a decision broadly about what, whether we should use acronyms or we should spell things out, it might be helpful for people as they're following along. Again, take it, leave it, whatever. There's a lot of good work that's been done. And it's not a huge concern. It was just an observation.
Anybody else?
I think back to Ted's point, that open space. I guess I could aim this question at both Kathy and Cindy. So where it says, unless an equally effective alternative community framework is established. Is that, in your opinions, broad enough to maybe address some of the things that Ted's talking about, where we have urban development north of 21 and large acreage lots on the south? Cindy, you run into this, you mentioned some municipalities, Medina, some of the larger acreage that have they run into this issue where they have used that? And when I say that, unless an equally effective alternative community framework is established, if we decide to establish something that fits that for a specific development in large acreage, Does that have to go back to the DNR for them to approve? That yes. We accept that you have grounds to do something different, or is that something that we decide? As a planning commission and a city, that is, to Ted's point. Do we have some freedom there as to what is an equally effective alternative framework?
So first off, a number of different types of applications, when they're within the shoreland area.
Mhm.
We will be required, depending on what it is, to notify the commissioner of the DNR.
Okay,
And that this is going on, that this is being proposed, and they'll have an opportunity to review and provide comment.
Okay.
And so in those circumstances, that would be when we would discuss those types of things with them.
okay. Thanks.
And then we would wait and see what their comments were.
The DNR, as you said, you know, they provide comments when you're working within the shoreline. I just came from a city with 5 lakes. Our DNR, we talked frequently, when we looked at shoreline management. You know, they'll provide comments, they'll say, you know. They'll look at, should we tweak this, should we do this, should you make these amendments? You can go, I mean, we have the authority, so I mean, once they provide those comments, it's they don't approve it or disapprove it, it's ours to approve or disapprove. But I will say, if we go and we approve something that they don't recommend, they will evaluate that. And, you know, speaking from one where my council approved one that they didn't recommend, and they filed a lawsuit. So.
What was the result of that though? Did you just withdraw then? Or did you undo what was done and then the lawsuit dropped right away? So there was no cost?
They were still in negotiations on where that was going when I left, but there was, you know, there was the lawsuit that was filed. So now that was an extreme case of setting precedent, but you have that ability. I mean, they are no longer, once they provide the comment, because you said, will they approve it or they don't approve or disapprove, they provide comments, they provide their recommendations. And that comes into you as another piece of this packet that you get on these applications to consider what the DNR is thinking about.
Yeah, and we're talking, I mean. I agree with what's written here. There has to be a framework established. There has to be, otherwise. We will have an ordinance book that is, I don't know how long it would take us to really make it effective, because whether Ted as a developer says this or some other developer wants this. Or Mr. Homeowner wants this. I do agree there has to be a framework. And that's why within the framework of this. Yes, if I came in and I wanted to do something, I know I have to kind of I have to fit this to begin with, but if I want to make some changes, they'll be minor. Rather than saying, I'm gonna go off the radar here and do my own deal. And so I. Personally. I believe that we need a framework like this, we do. And that's for preservation also of what we are trying to do here as a city, which is preserve what we have. And I think that's an important part that we need to look at within our city of Credit River. What are we preserving? What are we doing? Thanks.
Can I ask a follow-up question? In communities in Western Hennepin County that have some similarities, are we seeing where there are different definitions or different parts of the ordinance that apply or don't apply, or separate ordinances guiding this?
Not typically, it would be challenging to have, especially in the definition section, right? To have a definition mean one thing in one part of the community and a different thing in a different part of the community. Why would they not be the same?
Yeah.
When you see carve outs, it's really more by zoning district typically.
Okay. That would make sense.
I mean, that said, one of the hotly discussed items between us and the DNR staff was definitions in this ordinance, because of course I tried to keep all of ours. And the definition for PUD is one of the ones where we ended up compromising, so it's not exactly the one in their state model statute standard, but it's tailored a little bit.
What page is that on?
It's on page 5. because their definition for PUD, I didn't want to adopt into our ordinance and have that usurp everything else going on everywhere else.
Yeah.
So if you see that definition, kind of the first part is theirs, and then I have except within the shoreland area and the rest of it that's ours. To kind of carve out that there might be this little difference there between shoreland and the rest of the community. But that's again shoreland and the rest of the community as opposed to north versus south.
Mm,
You have a lot of experience working with the DNR.
Mhm.
Would they laugh at us if the things Ted brought up tonight? Would they laugh at us if we said we want to, we're changing all these things because we're different?
They would want to know what the rationale is for that. Which we did discuss with them about the 35 feet
Yeah.
and went through that.
But what about the decks and the swimming pools and the setbacks and 25 acres versus 10?
The 25 acres versus 10, I don't think they'd give on that at
Okay.
all.
Not the others.
The decks and everything, again, that's their standard definition for what is impervious. It's not. And certainly a swimming pool. It's, yes, Ted's right that the water might be flowing into the pool. And evaporating potentially then.
I lived in Texas and they don't always evaporate if you get big rains.
They might run out, yeah. But at the same time, it's also not allowing water to infiltrate in that location. So it is definitely impervious.
got it.
We're not being overly conservative in any of our language. We're not like trying to prevent anything that other cities.
No,
Wow.
we didn't go above and beyond and make it more restrictive.
Anyone else have any questions? Thank you. Nope. I'm looking for a motion.
I'll make a motion to approve it, the shoreland ordinance.
Okay, I hear I have a motion from Steve to recommend to the city council to approve ordinance. Which one is it? It's 2023-07. Do I have a second? Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Second. Amy, and first by Steve, all in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. Anyone opposed? Hearing none, motion is carried. Thank you. The next public hearing we have tonight is related to ordinance 2023-04, regulating THC products. All commission members should have received a copy of the proposed ordinance. Before I open the public hearing, could we have City Administrator Reynolds maybe summarize the ordinance that's in front of us, and we'll actually maybe let the public know, like, why is the planning commission getting involved in this ordinance as opposed to the city council?
Call this up and
Could you hit your button too?
Very much.
There we go. So the planning commission is looking at the ordinance on what I have up here is calling the low dose, the THC edibles. The statute, we have two different items and two different ordinances that the city is considering at this point in time. I'll kind of walk through maybe a little bit of this, give a little bit of background to kind of help. We talked about it at the July council meeting, so I'm just going back over this one. So 2022, the state passed the legislation legalizing the sale of edible cannabinoid products. So these THC edibles, as we kind of shorthand this down. The city council did adopt an interim ordinance at that point in time, putting a moratorium in place. And that was in August of 2022. That has now expired as of July 31st of this year. And it was give time to kind of look at what do we want to do moving forward. In the interim point in time, the state in 2023 passed legislation legalizing adult use cannabis. So this is what we call the recreational marijuana, the legalization of that. In this legislation, they provided additional framework for the low dose, the edibles. And created the Office of Cannabis Management. Office of Cannabis Management is charged with enforcing and organizing a regulatory system for the cannabis industry, which eventually will include these low dose edible products. That is expected to be in place by January of 2025. So we're kind of in this interim window right at the moment with the low dose where it's legal and we have the ability to move forward. Our moratorium has expired, but the state regulatory system is not set up and in place yet. So this ordinance that you're looking at tonight is really meant to be, yeah, again, not an official interim ordinance, but it is an interim ordinance. It is kind of an interim structure for the city to look at licensing and regulating these low dose THC edible products within our city limits until the state comes in and sets up their framework, which we anticipate being ready in January of 2025. Once their framework comes on board, they'll have a licensing structure for the businesses and they will be licensed through the state. And then we'll have it. So we will, our licensing structure would go away at that point in time and we'd fall into the state process then. But this is to kind of get us through this hurdle of time until we get to that piece. Under the 2023 legislation, they did provide some additional guidance on what local governments can do. A lot of it is geared more towards the recreational, but as we look at here on this one, we talk about we can adopt reasonable restrictions on the time, place, and manner of cannabis businesses. And it sets up a structure where it says we may prohibit within 1,000 feet of a school or 500 feet of a daycare, residential treatment facility, or attraction within a public park used by minors. We've taken those restrictions and those that the state has set out to say these are what we say is reasonable, you can adopt. That's what's incorporated into our ordinance. So we want to do more, we can't do more. You know, this is what the state has basically said and said we can do. So these are, you know, we had some conversations about, can we make it further from the school? Can we make it further from daycare? This is where the state said it. And because of this kind of language here, where we're talking about restrictions on your land use, that's why it's here at the planning commission for this public hearing. So the planning commission deals with any of the items in the city that's dealing with land use and land use regulations. This ordinance, while it's a business licensing ordinance is also regulating kind of your land use. So the planning commission gets to hear this first. We'll do the public hearing here and then I'll go to the council for action. As we kind of move on, the recreational marijuana, that is a separate ordinance. The legislation in 2023 allowed an interim moratorium on the recreational marijuana to be adopted by cities that would be in effect until January 2025, which allows us that gap while the state figures out their licensing and regulatory framework. We can say not inside our boundaries until we see what the state's going to do, and then we can take action from there on what we want to do in regards to the recreational marijuana. So you do not have that ordinance in front of you. That we do have an interim ordinance for a moratorium on the recreational marijuana that the council will be considering and holding a public hearing on at their meeting on Monday night, August 21st. So that's a separate ordinance, a separate process, doesn't include land regulation. So that one's not here in front of you tonight. The low dose THC does include land regulation. So you're having a public hearing on this one this evening. So two different ones that are being taken into consideration, dealing with the two different pieces of this marijuana and the THC legislation that the state has not passed. So
That was very helpful. Thank you.
Very.
Okay, great. I'm going to open up the public hearing now related to proposed ordinance 2023-04 regulating THC products. This is a time for residents to provide comments pertaining to this ordinance. Did we receive any written comments by residents?
I received one email that was in favor of,
Okay,
you know, and it wasn't geared towards either the,
but
Bad.
maybe a bad battery. There we go.
Yeah. I received one email comment in regards to kind of the overarching ordinances and regulating in this area, not specific to the low dose or specific, basically in favor of the city adopting its ordinances.
Okay. Great, thank you. Are there any residents present tonight that would like to comment on this proposed ordinance? If so, I'd ask you to go up to the podium, state your name and address. Any non-resident want to speak? Why are they giggling? Okay. Seeing there's no residents here tonight to comment on this proposed ordinance, can I get a motion to close the public hearing?
I'll make a motion to close the hearing.
Motion by Commissioner Tandy, is there a second? I'll second. Seconded by Commissioner Casey, all in favor, indicate by saying aye. Anyone opposed? Hearing none, motion to close public hearing is carried. Any comments, questions from any commission members related to this ordinance?
Just a couple, and I
Yep.
I think I see others have some too. A lot of mine were answered, through the presentation, so I really appreciate that. As a refresher, we're talking about limiting or restricting these businesses to commercial and industrial areas. Is it possible to pop the map up to show where those districts are?
And I want to piggyback on why is industrial in that definition too, I mean.
Give me a minute and I'll pull the map up.
You took the next question out of my mouth. That's all right. Great minds think alike.
While Cindy's pulling up the map, I think, looking at commercial industrial, we know we have very limited areas of those in the city. I think we have you want to look at this to withstand time. I think while we know this is where we're at today, you don't want to, if we amend things, we don't want to have to come back and remember, oh, well, we need to go and touch this one, or we need to touch this one. We do have a list of eligible businesses in here for who can receive, a license for it. And most of those are not going to be found within an industrial district, but it's kind of all encompassing.
So this is sort of the city zoning map on the screen. It is definitely the one that's online. We did do a rezoning in the last year of a couple of parcels, these two right here. Some of you might remember Action Overhead and Krieger Excavating.
Yeah.
And those are now industrial instead of commercial. But generally, the map is still useful for this discussion because basically only anything in pink would be eligible.
I think that's really helpful. I recognize that it's impossible to predict, but under a scenario where, say, a school was built or a daycare facility opened after one of these businesses have been licensed, would they have a legacy clause? Would there be an exception to that ordinance about the distance?
Looking at what we have in here, I think at this point in time, I don't know that we don't have anything in here that would require, that kind of defines that legacy piece. But I also know that this is an area where I think the state is going to be in their regulatory structure. Will be weighing in some on that with that one. So
And as
definitely something to consider and think about as we look at what do we do moving forward. But as I look at this one, this gets us to January 2025, which is important. Yes. And so I'm not sure that one is there, but definitely something to kind of make a note of and think about as we look at what do we do once we see what the state does with that 2025 deadline for the overarching cannabis business, including us.
I just had one other question, and this goes back actually to the first line of questioning with regard to the zoning districts. If we were considering other businesses such as like, off sale liquor license or something like that, they would be restricted to this type of zoning district, if I understand correctly.
Correct.
Okay. Just trying to understand analogies. Thank you, I appreciate it.
So we talked about where it can be used. You know, private property. Territories, walking path. Maybe, or even their community building, owned and maintained within the community, their community. Can it be used or can it be THC products be used?
Right now, yes. I mean, this,
Even though there's kids present, it can still be used.
yes. It is legal. What this is not controlling the use of it, so the edible.
No, sales
is-
only.
This is sales, this is business, it's regulating the businesses that are selling it. Providing a regulatory structure on that and where they can sell it. It does have, you know. To purchase, you have to be 21, which is in the state statute, so it's just regurgitating that fact that's in here. But somebody could purchase it from a business that's selling, say down in Jordan, because I know they don't have a moratorium in place and they've got, I think, some stores down there. So I'll just use Jordan. You could go to Jordan and buy it and you can come back and yes, eat them, drink them, whatever, within Credit River. This does not prohibit that one. Now, recreational marijuana is in a different category with, when you're looking at that one, but your THC, your edibles, you could still use them. You just can't purchase them. In no business, this would regulate the sale of them within the city.
So if I'm opening a business at my house. And it's online sales only, and I'm basically taking product, I'm the guy in the middle, right? I'm taking product from that destination and I'm selling it over there to that destination. Allowed or not allowed?
I believe because you would need a license, correct? And as part of searching for a license, since you're in a house, you wouldn't be in a commercial or industrial district, so not allowed.
It's gotta be storefront. as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah, it can't be
storefront.
Can't be movable, it's gotta be a
Do it on
storefront.
your house.
I trust me, right after it's passed, I saw basically food truck equivalent selling edibles, and so this prohibits that.
Okay.
Anyone else? I have a few, but we give other people a chance. Was this a template kind of like the Minnesota City legal Minnesota cities, or did we make this ourselves, or did we use someone else?
This is one that our city attorney had drafted and they've used in several of the communities that they represent.
Great.
And it's very close and similar to one that we implemented in Fairmont where I was at, and that I've seen many communities implement.
Is it typical that there's no like, how are we gonna enforce this? How do you know that someone's not gonna be selling it outside their home? I mean, there's penalties in here, but there's no like enforcement of how we're gonna go.
Somebody in letting us know, letting the sheriff's department know, we have to find out about it in some way, shape or form.
It's no different than before when it was illegal.
Okay.
Yeah.
Alright. On page 5, under section E revocation and suspension, paragraph 3. I don't know if that word should be council. It says, unless the licensee has notified the council of the change, should it be the city notifies the city? Or typically the city gets notified of things that.
Yeah.
I don't know if we want to change that one. I'll leave that up to you, Kathy. You already answered the commercial. We don't have any option to increase the fee of a school or daycare and all that stuff. So, on page 8, paragraph 5, the applicant is a business that does not have an operating officer or manager who is eligible pursuant to the provisions of this order. What exactly does that mean? An operating officer or manager? Isn't it the person that is the applicant? Like, who would do this if it wasn't a manager of the business?
So
I just didn't even, I didn't know what an.
So the applicant is a business that doesn't, what you're looking at is go back up to 3. If you've been convicted within the past 5 years and you have that, so if your business, if you're operating officer or managers, you have to. You're looking at those to make sure that, you meet all of these requirements that are in here, and if you've been convicted, you have the convictions, then you don't meet the requirements.
Okay. Right. Signage on page 9. So it says that we're gonna provide the licensee with the signage. So we have some.
So where you're,
Oh, I'm sorry, it's B, legal age, and then under number 2. The licensee is going to have to post in a manner clear, and it says that we provide the signs. Is that right?
we'll have,
Provide them?
yeah, that, it's
It's just
just
the
little
license.
placard type stuff and licensing, so, yeah,
okay,
we would provide that.
okay, sorry. I was thinking of different signs, right? The annual fee on the last page, the annual fee of $250 per year. Is that negotiable or is that in the state statutes too?
I don't think the state statute set a fee at this point in time, so that it can be a negotiable amount that we could look at doing. You always have to take into consideration when you look at setting those kinds of fees. If they challenge them, it has to be reasonable for the work that is entailed in processing and working with it.
And there would be a lot of work involved in processing a license. Because $250 isn't a lot these days.
Now, and you,
You have to do a background check, you may have to have the attorney look at where they're, all that stuff, and I was just wondering if the $250 should be something higher. But if that's consistent with maybe what other cities are charging and or consistent with other licenses that are similar. Then I'm okay keeping it, it's just.
I think you look at it and say, what are we charging other businesses? If you have tobacco licenses, alcohol licenses, you gotta kind of put them
Is
in
the-
line with that one, so,
Do you think
That's
the
the amount that
$250?
no, the alcohol one is larger than that.
Yeah,
So,
It's a couple thousand.
mhm.
so I guess I don't understand why we wouldn't have a higher, I mean,
we can, that's an easier, I mean, that's something that we can change. If you think you'd recommend a higher one, we can.
I just don't know what the
It's
number
something
is,
a little
but
bit
if Dean says it's a couple $1,000 for liquor, why wouldn't we want it? It's an intoxicating type of thing, it's like, to me, there's no difference.
I think there's some way to offset the. I guess Minnesota, I guess, is looking into what worked and didn't work for Michigan as well as Colorado.
Yeah.
And there's been some studies that have came back saying that, you have to bring your police force up. And then it also started getting a lot of the street drugs back in and the fentanyl. Because they could find it a little cheaper. So the whole thing, I guess, something we need to discuss, no question, but I think we also need to pump the brakes a little bit and kind of wait to see what state's all going to do, but we just need to be prepared for when somebody applies. Or what can we actually do? How much time do we want to spend on this?
So is it my understanding then that this, just to clarify, that this is essentially interim until the Office of Cannabis Management would then have licensing processes? And then at that point, they would take over.
Correct. The legislation, the 2023 legislation sets up the Office of Cannabis Management. They will take over the business licensing of these businesses. So this licensing structure will go away once Office of Cannabis Management sets that up. And then it comes back to us as far as zoning restrictions and so forth. And that's what will be. Once we figure out what the state's doing, we're all kind of in limbo. That's why we're looking at the moratorium on the recreational. is to allow the state to get their structure set up so that we can then consider what's the reasonable restrictions and zoning to implement all of that. So once we get to that January 2025, the state will have taken on this licensing. They'll have the licensing of the larger scale recreational marijuana as well. And then we will be redoing, in essence, kind of some of those other, the reasonable time, place restrictions that are contained in here. And we'll incorporate all of that into one, new ordinance with more, hopefully more guidance from the state. And the state is also, they've been tasked with also preparing a model ordinance for communities to kind of work hand in hand with what they're doing. So
I'm pretty sure they'll have that fee though, like.
right, they usually set some kind of a state fee that they'll have for their licensing, and then there'll probably be some fees for the local levels that we can use and collect as well. But
So this cannabis committee be doing compliance checks or? Because I know Scott County Sheriff's Department does the compliance checks for cigarette sales and alcohol as well, but we discussed who's gonna babysit this.
the local police departments
Yeah.
and sheriff's departments will be,
Just put
That's-
more on their plate.
they set up the licensing framework. They notify us that if a business wants to open up in here, does it meet our zoning requirements? We have a kind of a yay or nay, say on some of those pieces under the regulations that they're looking at right now. And then they would approve of the license. So there's some interplay going back and forth, but like I said, how does all of that work? We're all still waiting to see.
So what we're looking at here is just basically to bridge between here and January of 2025.
Correct.
And do we have, in the city of Credit River, do we have any retail sales of anything currently?
No.
Not traditional, not traditional in a storefront.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah, it's the garage door, yeah, repairs.
right. As far as, I'm looking at what you spoke to, the costs that the city will incur because of the sale of products. And whether it's increased law enforcement or regulation. And now this $250 license fee is right now basically just to cover the city's cost in issuing the license, not to cover anything else associated with the product itself or what could happen with that product.
Correct. You look at what are your costs and kind of the review and the issuance of the licenses. And like I said, I know some communities have made it higher. I think I've heard as high as $1,000 in some, but you kind of look at that and say, what's reasonable given where we're at.
I think that's go ahead.
If I may interject really quick, Commissioner Tandy is correct that our on sale intoxicating liquor license is $2,000, but I looked it up on our off sale intoxicating liquor license, which this would be more similar to, is $250.
Do you feel comfortable that would cover the cost, at least for processing the license? I know the philosophy has been development business is paying for itself, so I just, since the question's been raised.
I think for this point in time, I think the $250 is adequate. And I think, with the limitation on the eligible businesses and the commercial and the industrial, I don't believe we'll really see the applications for it. But this is just in case something comes into that qualification zone.
I think Kathy, to your point, I just want to make sure that the city doesn't incur costs in this. You look at $250. I mean, one phone call to an attorney, all of a sudden we're losing money on this deal. And that'd be my main concern, whether the $250 is high enough to cover our costs. Now, I also agree that the odds of even a business setting up in the city of Credit River in the next year and a half is probably slim to none. But with that, if we set a fee now, are we stuck with that as we move forward in 2025? Or do we change that to whatever we think? All of a sudden we look at it and man, our costs are $2,500 to issue this license, background checks, whatever else we got to do. We can change this and up it.
You can, but the background checks and all those types of things will be done by the state.
Okay. So
As long
you're,
as they don't pass them through to us.
Yes, and I say that. But we know we saw legislation in 22, we know we saw legislation in 23. You know, I don't know what comes next, but. Way it's set up at this point in time is they would be the ones that would be responsible, this Office of Cannabis Management would be the ones that would be responsible for that. They send stuff to us, we have some say, we have some input, the way it's appears that they're structuring it at this point in time. But that they are the ones that would do all the licensing. And then there's fees associated with all this, and there's a portion of that, and I don't know it off the top of my head, but there's a portion of that that does come down to the cities and counties. From the taxes, I think it's the taxes on it, I don't. But there's money that's supposed to come to the cities from this process to help us with the enforcement at that point.
we've all seen that before, the money, the trickle down effect, by the time it gets to us, the little bucket gets really tiny. So I just want to make sure then that if in the event that we need to change that $250 amount. If we say, yeah, this is okay. It doesn't take an act of God to change that.
The simple ordinance amendment.
Okay,
Okay. Thank you.
Well, the cannabis management, this, whatever committee that the state has put together, will they be transparent so we can even see it? And see what neighboring or other municipalities or communities are doing? So we can copy somebody else what they've, so we're kind of, on the
But-
same page.
Yes, well, they're supposed to, the ordinance or this legislation tasked them with coming up with a model ordinance.
Yeah.
But more important than, on the state side, city administrators around the state have been communicating on these on a regular
Yeah,
basis.
They're always
and-
talking.
and sharing and what are you doing? What are we doing? Here within Scott County with our scale. This is a frequent topic of conversation of all the administrators when we get together to say, okay, what are you doing in your city? What are you doing in your city? And sharing stuff back and forth. So.
Good.
Regardless of what the state does, we have the conversations going right now to say, who's doing what and how are you doing it?
Awesome.
Anything else? Nope. Can I get a motion to approve ordinance 2023-04? Can I get a motion to recommend to the city council to approve ordinance 2023-04, regulating THC products? So motion by Commissioner Olson, is there a second?
A second.
Seconded by Commissioner Andy. All in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Hearing none, motion carried. There's no other business in front of us, so can I get a motion to close tonight's planning commission?
I'll make that motion.
Motion by Commissioner Wolf, is there a second? Second by Commissioner Casey, all in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Anyone opposed? Hearing none, motion to adjourn is carried. Thank you, everyone. And then see you.